Hello, this is your professor again, joining you from the future. Okay, not really, but it is 1.5 years after I recorded the last video. There was just a few other things that I wanted to add. So here I go. One of them is that I mentioned a reading in last video called Traditions Carried On. I no longer have you do that reading in the first week, so apologies if that was a little confusing. We actually will be doing that reading. Well, it actually is this week because it's like the summer condensed thing, but anyways, not for this module. So if you were confused by me referencing a reading that you haven't done yet, I apologize. But you did do a different reading actually for this topic, which was the Colleen Yari Walker reading, Keep Paddling Against the Wind. I really like the way that this reading talks about cultural difference in a very sort of practical way. And among other things, her speaking about the tendency that she observed moving to Anchorage with people feeling uncomfortable with silence, whereas that was something she was very comfortable with. It reminds me of some of the experience I have had in working in Indigenous communities, and also of teachings that I have heard, such as we don't speak for nothing, right? So this idea of sort of silence being okay and not having to fill every silence, that's very hard for me to be used to, because I tend to be somebody that fills the silence with a lot of words. But it's a good example of sort of a practical cultural difference that Walker is picking up on between herself and some of the other people that she was newly surrounded by. And I like bringing up that reading because it shows us that people's unique cultural backgrounds continue to inform them to this day, that these cultures are not past tense. And yet at the same time, of course, people experience kind of this balancing of different identities now, as many of us have sort of multiple cultures going on, or maybe one culture, but then sort of a broader culture that you're a part of. She talks about sort of this quote unquote balancing our lives if we come from more than one culture. So I hope you like that reading. A couple of other things that I wanted to add. One is these are kind of a grab bag of different things that I wanted to add into the last video. First one is, I strongly recommend going to this website if you've never done it before. It's native-land.ca. It is a website that shows, there we go. Basically, I actually wanted to show languages. Basically shows if you're in, if you're in a new location, what Indigenous community is traditionally of that area, what land you are on. And so it may be, for example, I often speak as if most of us are in Anchorage or Matsu or Kenai Peninsula, given that, this is a KPC/UAA course, but it may be that you specifically live out in Bethel, in which case you're in the traditional homelands of the territory of the Yupik people, Central Yupik peoples. And so anyways, it's a great website to have, especially if you end up moving around the country. You can learn and I think become more educated in that way. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Now, in the last video, I also talked about this idea that Alaska Native is not a single community or culture. We can speak of certainly many similarities that people can have across communities, such as respect for elders, for example, or the idea that hunting and fishing involves social relationships with the beings hunted and fished, and those kinds of things carry over across many of the groups in our state. But at the same time, there is a tremendous amount of diversity as well. So I made a typo in the last video. It's 20 native languages, not 21 native languages. It's 20 native languages, and I think I was adding English for some weird reason, so apologies for that. But those 20 languages, I also wanted to clarify that they can be grouped into what we call language families. So what is a language family? A language family is when languages are similar enough to each other, despite being different languages, that we can tell that they probably came from a similar root. or parent language. So a good example is like the Romance languages in Europe. We don't call them the Romance languages because they're romantic, even though maybe they sound romantic to some people. We call them the Romance languages because they are all heavily influenced by the Roman language, aka Latin. So Spanish, French, Italian, Roma. These languages sound like each other for a reason, and that reason is that they all are heavily influenced by the parent language of Latin, as well as other things that were going on in their respective areas. And so that's the idea of a language family, a bunch of related languages where some of the words are the same, or some of the kind of ways that the language is structured are the same. And Alaska is, in a sense, very diverse because we actually have kind of 4 language families in our state, which is a lot. And so the one of them is what used to be called Eskimo Alio, and you'll still see that referred to that way sometimes, but I'll try to get you guys to instead be saying Inuit Yupik Unungan, even though it's a little longer. It's more preferred terminology and more accurate as well. But anyways, these languages right here, all the ones that are in like winter colors of blue and green, these are all related to each other. They have similarities to each other. And then there's Tsimshian languages, which there's just a small Tsimshian community at Metlakatla here in Alaska, and that's its own language family. There's Haida, and Haida, nobody really knows. Some people think that it's distant relatives with these languages. Other people think it's what's called a language isolate. And a language isolate, you shouldn't like feel sad for a language isolate, like, oh no, it's all by itself. What that means is that language is so unique that we're not sure where it came from, which is kind of freaking awesome if you are interested in languages at all. So anyways, Haida may or may not be its own language thing going on. And then the final language family to discuss is what we call Na-Dene. Na-Dene is all of these summer colors of red and pink, and then also these like yellow colors. So Iyak, Tlingit, and then all of these Athabascan languages. Now, as implied by what I just said, what we call the Na-Dene language family is actually it's like a Russian doll situation going on. You've got a language within a language family within a language family. So there's actually the Athabascan language family, which is what you'll hear people say a lot more often, which is a full half of the languages here in Alaska. A full half of the cultures are what we call Athabascan languages. So you'll hear people say things like, oh, I'm not Athabascan, or oh, I'm Wichin Athabascan. And what they're referring to is these like 10 closely related languages and cultures. So that's a language family, but it's within a bigger language family that we call Na-Dene, that also includes Iyak, and also, by the way, includes Tlingit if you go way distantly enough. So all of that to say that Alaska is incredibly diverse. When we talk about like the difference between 2 language families, it's not like, I think I said this in the previous lecture, but it's not like the difference between, French and Spanish, or Spanish and Portuguese. So when we talk about the difference between like the Inuit related languages or the Athabascan languages, it's not like French and Spanish. We're very, very similar with some differences. Instead, the difference would be a lot more like Mandarin Chinese and Russian, right? Like major fundamental differences. So you have a lot of different sounding languages here in Alaska that are beautiful and rich and diverse. This is a painting that was done in 1827 that is a Europeans' representation of people's ceremonial dress, specifically from Unangash, Shukpiak, and Tlingit backgrounds, just to show kind of another way of showing diversity is sort of how people dressed. Of course, that's kind of simplistic, but it's also a very sort of obvious visual way we can visualize and understand how diverse our state is, and that this isn't just sort of all one culture. Another way of thinking about the diversity of our culture, or of our cultures here in Alaska, in terms of indigenous cultures, is we can think of what I'm going to call culture groups or culture regions. So what I mean by that is, we would say that there are at least 20 different Alaska Native cultures, right? Because of the 20 different languages. But then you can kind of put some of those in groups based on some degree of similarities. So you have, for example, oftentimes people will put Aleut and Alutiiq or Unangash and Shukpiaq as kind of a region of people having some similar adaptations to kind of this coastal/island environment. And then sort of Yupik and Chupik, and then Inupiaq, and a small group called the St. Lawrence Island Yupik. And then the Athabascan groups tend to be kind of, people sometimes think of that as like one kind of culture group or culture region, a group of related cultures, a cluster of cultures. And then the Southeast groups like Eyak, Haida, Tsimshian, and Tlingit, which despite having really different languages, have quite a few similarities in terms of like ceremony and artwork and symbolism and story and things like that. So you think of it that way, and we have basically 5 different kind of major cultural groups in Alaska. That's another way to think about it. So, but yet another way to think about this diversity is to say that we have 200 different tribal entities here, distinct tribes in Alaska. And that is just a profound, sorry, I had to look up the number to make sure I wasn't misquoting it, so I should have said 228 different tribes, which, you know, on the one hand, we sometimes as anthropologists, right, we tend to think in terms of like an entire language or culture. But if you listen to how people identify themselves, it's also very common for people to say like, oh, well, I'm from Cantwell or I'm from Tanacross, right, and kind of identify by the specific tribe, or sometimes by the specific village that they're from, like, oh, I'm Comanche, right, as a type of tribe, or oh, I'm from Ninilchik, or oh, I'm from Tanacross. So people often identify by their tribe or specifically a village-based tribe. And so again, profound amounts of diversity. We don't want to overplay it, but it's worth remembering that, you know, not all of these people are practicing or speaking the exact same things traditionally, and that's worth remembering. And that's part of the beauty of who we are as a state and of Alaska Native people. This is also one final way to think about kind of the diversity of our state. Another way that people might identify, although I'd say this is less common for people to identify this way, in my experience, but it's by corporations. So we'll get way more into this in a few weeks, but there is something called Alaska Native Regional Corporations, and they are a type of tribal entity that's very, very unique, and it's really only in Alaska. We'll talk about what that means later, but basically there are 13 of them, and this is the map of the 13, and they sort of overlap with cultural groups and they sort of don't. So somebody might say, oh, well, I'm shareholder with Bristol Bay Corporation, as one example. And I think that that is kind of what I wanted to say. Oh, this was a final point that I wanted to make, which was sort of an example of colonialism being ongoing, because I made that claim in the last video, and I was a little dissatisfied with the fact that I didn't really show a really practical example other than sort of the passport example, right? I alluded to that communities have, you know, quite a few limits on them sometimes, but I didn't really get into what that is. So if you're ever kind of curious about the ongoing effects of one group's sovereignty being to some degree superseded by the United States coming in, you can see as an example of that kind of the battles that have occurred over subsistence fishing. And so from this is like super bare bones, just a few things I want to point out with it. This will come up in different ways later in the semester. But from 1870 to 1970, subsistence users had all sorts of major losses, so including many native subsistence users, so people that were still actively living from hunting, fishing, and gathering on the land, had all sorts of losses, not the least of which was certain portions of land being turned into things like wildlife refuges and national parks, which I enjoy wildlife refuges, and I'm not trying to diss on them, but one of the effects of that is that suddenly people's hunting practices are much more tightly controlled, if they're allowed at all, right? They often are in wildlife refuges, but under more controlled conditions. And then other things as well, right? Like this is the time period where you saw the rise of the commercial salmon industry, which many Native communities, that was a major employer, but at the same time that had effects, especially in certain areas where before they were outlawed, people would set up these like huge traps on the beaches that the commercial companies would, and that had effects. And then of course, just like ballooning of communities where there weren't communities, or rather I should say where there were not non-Native communities before, like Anchorage or like Soldotna. And so suddenly, if you are a Native person whose family has lived there for generations upon generations, suddenly you have 2, 3, 4 times as many people in your area to also be competing with for the same amount of fish or wildlife or plants to be gathered. So you can see that there were sort of all sorts of major effects during this time period. in 1971, you had the passage of a law called ANTH that we'll get into later. But part of the thing with ANTH is that a lot of lands that were being claimed by Alaska Native groups ended up in possession of the state or the federal government, but it was implied in that settlement that Native people would maintain subsistence rights to many of those lands surrounding their own communities. But then and that was in 1973, sort of Governor Egan made a promise about that sort of Alaska Native subsistence rights that further implied that. And in 1978, they attempted to pass a rural subsistence priority to kind of, it wasn't overtly stated as Alaska to protect Alaska Native subsistence, but it was implied that the rural communities, many of which were Alaska Native majority, would have kind of a priority if we had to decide that certain limits had to be placed in for hunting or fishing, that there would be a priority given to subsistence users that were rural. And then in 1980, you had ANILCA, which tried to make that more explicit and specifically spell it out for like federal lands, like federal parks. So that all seems like fairly clear cut, like that the overwhelming consensus in the law is that there's supposed to be sort of protection of Native subsistence rights on lands that were formerly Native lands and have since become in control by the state or feds. That seems clear cut. It was not. There was all sorts of different challenges like to that, including in 1985, what we call the Madison Court decision, which was more than I can get into right here, but basically came down with the decision that of the judges that it was discriminatory to set up a rural versus urban preference because of the Alaska state constitution. So suddenly Fish and Game was not supposed to do that, but in not doing that, suddenly the state became out of line with ANILCA, which said that they were supposed to give subsistence rights on public lands to Native peoples. And so there was that. And then in 1986, the Alaska legislature tried to get around that by redefining what they meant by rural. And then in 1986, there was the McDowell case where the judges were once again like, no, Fish and Game, you can't do that. So once again, the state of Alaska was out of compliance with federal wildlife and environmental law. 1988, again out of compliance. There was another thing called the Katie Johns case. We will get into that in a future lecture, but one of the points that I want to make is that eventually what happens is that the state government / judicial system forcing the government to do certain things versus over here, the federal government's stated prioritization conflicted. So eventually we end up with a system that we call dual management, which is very strange, just in comparison to other states, where you essentially have federal government managing certain wildlife and fish populations and state government managing others, and whether or not Alaska Native people have certain kinds of subsistence rights, depending in part on sort of which government owns a specific piece of land. And it is all very complicated. And that's not even getting into the fact that many Native tribal entities and communities were defined as rural, as not rural when all of this was going down, that really most people would probably think of as rural and still heavily use wildlife resources. And so the point of that story wasn't for me to have you memorize fishing history. So if your head is kind of spinning and you're like, geez, this is the first week, what is this guy doing to us? You can forget most of those details, or at least just have them in the back of your brain, as important as they are. But from a purely grading purpose, if that's all you care about, you don't have to memorize all those dates. But I want you to hear that story of subsistence rights, because so much of that is stories Alaska Native communities having to depend upon the goodwill, good intentions, and good policies, or sometimes lack thereof, of other governments, right? The fact that so much power was in the hands of the state and federal governments and courts shows you how much sovereignty had been controlled or eroded by outside entities, right? The ability of Native communities to make their own decisions on how to use wildlife on their own traditional homelands, right, had been severely affected by the ongoing involvement of governments other than the traditional governance in that area. And so my point there is not to say that where we currently are with subsistence is good or bad or otherwise. It's to suggest, though, that when I say that colonialism is something that has changed, but it's still there, this is kind of an example of what I mean, right? There are tribes, but then there are like the federal government and the state government who still can put a lot of limits on the tribes. So that's part of what I'm trying to get at there. Okay, that's it. That's the lecture. Just kidding. There's more videos, but that's the like kind of mini lecture that I hid within the bigger lecture of things that I wanted to update from the last video. Thank you so much.